Glory to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. This video will discuss the period leading up to the First Crusade and the beginning of the First Crusade in the year 1095. The video will begin with the year 1054 and the aftermath of the Great Schism and the apostasy of the papists. And I just want to reiterate the fact that all of these videos are not meant to be condemnatory in any way, but we must be able to discuss church history from the Orthodox perspective in an honest way. So we can see now, of course, that after the year 1054, unfortunately, the papist kingdoms would have fallen completely right away to papism, and that includes France, the HR Empire, Poland, Hungary, Croatia, the northern parts of the Iberian Peninsula outside of the Muslim-controlled areas in the north. And then also within Italy, it would have been, now even though that the areas in the south were still part of the Eastern Roman Empire, gradually they would have been pressured to come into papism over time, and also as well as Sicily. Now, England and the British Isles still had some more orthodoxy still for at least a little brief time after this, basically just 10 years before they're conquered by the Normans. And within the Islamic parts of Spain, gradually as the kingdoms in the north start pushing against the Moors, the Christians living under Islamic rule will eventually also become incorporated into the papists, and then fully papalized gradually. Now, among the most aggressive of all of the papist kingdoms in the west is actually this kingdom that has the horizontal lines here called Normandy. And in the previous videos was discussed the history of the Normandy and the Normans, that they were originally a Viking group that was pagan that settled in this area, and then in the early 900s had become Christian through the Latins, but then unfortunately they became fully papist and one of the most aggressive. Many of the Normans had become mercenaries and had taken over in the early part. It doesn't really show it on the map, but they had taken over some of the parts of southern Italy already, and they will actually become a major player in the Mediterranean in the period before and during the Crusades. And this issue of the Normans coming down into the Mediterranean, this was a very common thing actually of a lot of the Viking groups. Now, in the Eastern Roman Empire, around the time that the Rus had become Orthodox Christian, within the military of the Eastern Roman Empire, many of the Vikings had entered into military service, and they were called the Varangians. And the Rus themselves made up a large part of the Varangians. Sometimes they were called the Varangian Rus, but also other Rus. There were Swedish Varangians, Norwegian, and Danish Varangians also. And they made up actually the elite guard of the emperors in Constantinople. And many of them settled in certain places within Constantinople and some parts of Asia Minor. And they were Orthodox. These Varangian warriors were Orthodox. Unfortunately, in the case of the Normans, we see the opposite. We see a more papist Norman presence. But remember, the Normans, by this point, were not really identifying as Norse, but as a Norman identity that was more French-like, in the sense that the Normans were actually already speaking by this point the dialects of French by this point. Because remember, around this time, Latin was no longer spoken in the West. It had already pretty much started to diverge into the local vernaculars, which had become the dialects of the Romance languages that we know today. So the full Latin was really not spoken anymore. And like I mentioned in one of the previous videos, that was one of the reasons why there was also, ironically, the papists trying to push the Latin liturgically more, especially in the time of St. Kyrillos and St. Methodios, trying to push Latin onto the Slavs, when basically even in their areas, most of the people by then did not understand the Latin. And that's something that kind of goes hand in hand as they were falling further into heresy. That there was the situation where they kind of insisted on Latin, and the people were kind of left in the dark. Part of it was also so that the people, because remember, the papists will become, as time goes on, and it'll get much worse, but the papists themselves will become very hostile to any kind of education, as most of the population is now serfs. So they're basically slaves, basically, the 99% of the population, unless they were the landholding elite or the papist clergy. And so the papists will really outlaw reading and writing so that people cannot read the Holy Scriptures and not understand even the papal services. So there would be very little questioning of the papism. And that's was part of the actual reform of the papists that was going on at this time. This reform that was making it uh, so that the people would be much more of like a subjugated people, basically. So they wouldn't rise up against the papal heresy, unfortunately. Now I'm going to move forward about 12 years to the year 1066. And in the year 1066, we have the very famous uh, Battle of Hastings, which is where England, Anglo-Saxon England, was conquered by the Normans, and it becomes a single state. The Normans and England become one, or almost empire, really. But this kingdom under Norman England, and William the Conqueror, who conquered England, will that now, and the nobility will actually be Normans. Now, when England was conquered by the Normans, it was Edward the Confessor, who was the king, was actually he was the last king, and William the Conqueror was the one who really ruled. There was a Harold that only ruled for 9 months, but really William the Conqueror had taken over England, and now this was the papalization of England. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the bishop was replaced by Bishop Lanfranc of the Normans. And then England basically became extremely papist at this point. And part of the Norman conquest of England was that any kind of the older Orthodox monasticism really gradually started to disappear. Because once the Normans conquered England, and this will happen when England takes control of more areas, including Ireland, basically the any kind of remnants of orthodoxy will pretty much, especially when it comes to the understanding of ησυχία, the Orthodox monasticism and asceticism, that will also be pretty much eliminated, and it will be replaced by the Papist scholasticism. And a lot of the ancient monasteries that were even on some of the rocks, like Skellig Michael and off of the coast of Ireland, eventually those monasteries will be abandoned because the papists won't have that kind of asceticism anymore. And remember, when places like Ireland, when England conquers it and it becomes part of Norman England, the English, for the rest of history, will technically claim Ireland, and that will be the source of a lot of war, even leading up to modern times. If anyone remembers even issues like the IRA in the 20th century and these conflicts, the root of it is this period. And it's important for people to know that a lot of this is rooted in the fact that of the papism taking over this area. Now, as we see this aggression now and this empire building, which really starts around this time, especially with the Normans, we see that something interesting was happening on the other side with the Russians, because remember, uh, of course, we know that the Rus had become Orthodox in the time of Saint Vladimir, Grand Prince Vladimir, in the year 988, as mentioned a few videos ago. Now, around that time and shortly after, the Russians kind of went through a little bit of a tribulation when we have this situation where one of the sons of Vladimir, Saint Vladimir, Sviatopolk, he very aggressively took the throne and even murdered his brothers, who we know as Saints Boris and Gleb, who were very humble And of course, they didn't raise armies to fight their brother, but they were actually martyred technically by their own brother. And then, of course, we have, and then another relative, another half brother of them, who became that was up in Novgorod, came down and seized the throne of Kiev, and that was Yaroslav the Wise. And I just went back because this issue that happened with Saints Boris and Gleb and Sviatopolk, the wicked Sviatopolk, this all happened before the 1020s, before Yaroslav the Wise, their other brother, came to power in Kiev. But Yaroslav the Wise actually reposed in the year 1054. Interestingly, the same year as the Great Schism. So we see on the map, we see when we get to 1055, the Rus just basically remain as just the regional grand princes. And even though the Ruriks are in charge in these places, there's not one single Russian ruler over all of the Rus, not for a while. And it's interesting that we have this situation because remember, when it comes to the Orthodox understanding of Christendom, in the sense that originally in Orthodoxy, the Orthodox kingdoms like the Eastern Roman Empire, well, the Franks when they were Orthodox, but other kingdoms, the Georgians, people in the East, the kingdoms in the West, they were supposed to be living in a very in a harmonious Orthodox way, without wars between them. But we see that as the West falls away, these kingdoms are falling to papism and now becoming more empire builders in the spirit of Babylon. But interestingly, after the repose of Yaroslav, we see the situation where the Russians are actually politically fractured, and each of their states are somewhat independent of each other, which you could almost see that was almost like preserving really almost an Orthodox Christendom the way it should have been. And the Rus will remain like this for a while, and this is the way the Rus will be for the next few hundred years when they are conquered by the Mongols. But we're not up to that point yet. So from this point onward, all through the period of the Crusades, the Rus are of course all Orthodox, but they're politically fractured at this point. Also, with Yaroslav the Wise, his daughters had been married off to some of the major rulers in the West. For example, Elisiv, or Elizabeth of Kiev, was married to Harald Hardrada, who was the king of Norway. Anna of Kiev, another daughter of Yaroslav, she was married to Henry I of France. And then also, who else was there? I think there was Iziaslav I of Kiev married Gertrude of Poland, who was the daughter of King Mieszko. And then there was a Sviatoslav II who married possibly someone who was a noblewoman from Germany, but most likely within the HR empire here. So you can see that I know one of the most famous is Anna of Kiev, who married Henry I. And now it isn't known how they would have reacted to things like the schism, but unfortunately we know that they couldn't bring their spouses completely back to the degree that they would completely go against this papism, unfortunately. But we can see that these marriage alliances, unfortunately, don't necessarily help in the long term, as we'll see, because the Eastern Roman Empire will have many of these marriage alliances with the papists, but many times, unless if they physically move to the east, usually many times these spouses will apostatize, unfortunately. Now, going forward again to the year 1066 and the Battle of Hastings. And, well, I already mentioned that it was basically the Normans conquered England, and we have the beginning of the papalization of England. Now, some of the Anglo-Saxon English who were still Orthodox, many of them actually fled to the Eastern Roman Empire as Varangians. So there were actually also Anglo-Saxon Varangians. And many of these actually it was known that they actually settled on some parts of the Black Sea. And they had small settlements named after places in England, like London and York. But we don't know what the later fate, if they might have been only small villages, but they would have been absorbed into the larger population eventually. Another thing that I forgot to mention also, part of the ecclesiastical reform among the papists at this time was that the clergy of the papists now were all clean shaven. That was one of the things that symbolized the schism. Where before that the clergy still were bearded, as they would have been always before that, when the West was Orthodox. But at this point, now they're all clean shaven in a way that's much more familiar to us with papism, and it will only get worse as time goes on. Another thing that was developing during this time that will characterize the very dark age of the papists is this understanding of knighthood. Now remember, the kingdoms in the West as well as the East always had some kind of a military. I mean, certainly the Eastern Roman Empire always had a strong military with archers and cavalry and all the different the panoply of when it comes to military. But now the West started something that was also a perversion of monasticism, and that was the idea of knights. This idea of like a warrior monk who now, instead of fighting the passions, now basically kills people. It's a much more, it's taking what we understand in orthodoxy as fighting against the passions, and it becomes something that's very literal now, warrior like. And they even organized in a way that's a perversion of monasticism, where in a monastery you have monks under an abbot. Now you have these warrior soldiers that are these knights, and they're under a grand master. So it's a very big perversion. And this development of chivalry, this chivalry concept, which is connected with knighthood, is something that develops through papism, which was part of the rejection of Isuchia. So you see that there's this very big shift happening, even spiritually, because remember, it's all very much a spiritual warfare when it comes to this. Also, when it comes to heresy. Now, at this point, we'll discuss a little bit of now the beginning of the Crusades itself and what led up to it. Now, there was this development of the knighthoods and this fervor that was happening. There was a very big wave of violence that was happening, partially a result of the schism and kind of probably a very spiritual, demonic kind of consequence also of falling away from the church. That there was a wave in a lot of violence among a lot of the people. And in order to channel a lot of this violence, what happens is the leaders, especially now the heretical popes, they used it to channel the people now into war and into warfare. And remember, there's this twisting also even when it comes to understanding also of even the afterlife. Because of course in Orthodoxy, we have a very specific belief when it comes to life after death. And remember, just as we say in the Holy Creed, we look to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the age to come. And then earlier in the Creed we say that the Lord will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom shall have no end. These are all things that we understand because we know that as Orthodox Christians, when we repose, our souls are still awaiting. We're awaiting for the actual resurrection, where we believe very much so. It's very central to our belief as Orthodox Christians in the resurrection, the final general resurrection of all of the dead. All of the dead will raise, and then there will be the final judgment through our Lord Jesus Christ himself. And then we know that there will be the final Gehenna and the Lord's eternal kingdom, paradise, at the end. But remember, the papists had twisted this concept kind of into a very strange heaven above, hell below. They didn't really actually emphasize the resurrection anymore. It was very much die and go to hell, or you are good and you go to heaven. And and it's something that even affects affects even to this day a lot of the Western heterodox concepts of the afterlife. Uh, it also affected one of the things that some of the heresies like purgatory that the papists started to develop. But I'm not going to get so much into that. That'll discuss in a later video. But one of the things that the popes especially pushed was this idea of what's called indulgences, where people would pay money to go to heaven, or ensure that they go to heaven. And one of the things with the biggest indulgences that the popes, that specifically the heretical Urban II, who was the one, and let me just move forward a little bit now as we get closer to the year of 1095, because he did this in the year 1095. This was when the heretical Urban II went to the city of Clermont and actually preached this war, basically like a papist version of like a Islamic jihad almost. Because remember, it's the same spirit. This same spirit of earthly conquest, the spirit of Babylon, manifests itself in different ways. Among the papists, it manifested itself as the Crusades. That's why it happened right when the papists broke away from the church. That was the spiritual consequence of breaking away from the church. And then for the Muslims, of course, it's this Islamic jihad kind of spirit, which is exactly the same thing. It's just the raging of the nations, basically. But in this case, worse, because the papists are doing it as being apostasy, basically. And one of the things that Urban II, the heretical Urban II, that he promised the people was that if they went on this huge war against the Muslims to retake Jerusalem, that people would go to heaven. Their sins would be forgiven. They would get some kind of absolution. So a lot of the population now participated in this, and it was this participation also in the Crusades that was such a big part of the West at the time. Almost all of the papist nations participated in it. That really sealed the deal when it came to also papism, being so very much now entrenched in the West. Because now by this point, there's really very little, if any, there's really no more orthodoxy now left in the West, except maybe Ireland, because Ireland won't be conquered until the 1060s. But when it comes to most other places, it's already now in this very violent papist kind of mode of thinking. Now, part of what precipitated, I mentioned this in the previous video, was that you have this Turkic Islamic empire called the Seljuks that had conquered a large part of the Middle East. And in the Battle of Manzikert, the Seljuks had managed to conquer a large part of Asia Minor, which would basically be the beginning of the Turkic Islamic, the Muslim Turkic migrations into Asia Minor itself. And the Seljuks, remember, will be the predecessor of the Ottomans themselves. But now we have this situation where part of the Seljuks had actually broken away from the larger Seljuks and established this Islamic state that says Rome. Interestingly, because, remember, this Asia Minor was long considered to be part of the Eastern Roman Empire. So even among the Muslims, they refer to this territory as being Roman territory. Because by Roman, they mean the Eastern Roman Empire, the Empire of Constantinople, Nea Romi. So when the Muslims established this state, this is actually called the Sultanate of Rum, almost like a Roman sultanate. So they preserved the name Roman because they understood that they were on Roman territory still. Now, the Sultanate of Rome had actually taken the city of, it's hard to see on here, but they had also taken the city of Nicaea at some point. But when the Seljuks had taken these parts of the Middle East, as even the Holy Land, there was a lot of violence and persecution against the Christians. So that is also what the heretical Pope was alluding to. But he was basically promising that if they went against these so-called Turks, that people would just go to heaven. Now, of course, what it really was, their real goal was to establish papism and to force papism now on the Orthodox populations of the East. Now, remember, militarily, until this time, the Eastern Roman Empire was still very militarily strong. The West did not have the ability to necessarily raise an army to challenge the Eastern Roman Empire, and they didn't have the ability to challenge uh, the Muslims. But now, because of the papism and the feudal nature of papism, they were sort of able to now raise a large army, international. Because remember, now the army of the Crusades is an international army among the papist states. So they were able to raise a large enough army. And remember, though, part of this also was the fault also of the Eastern Roman Empire. Because remember, the emperor at the time was Alexios II, Komnenos, because now it's the Komneni dynasty in the Eastern Roman Empire. They allowed it because remember, they had just lost this big loss because of the Seljuks in Asia Minor, and the Turks were encroaching on Constantinople, which is right here, and the other cities like Prusa, which is right here. So they felt that they actually aided the Crusaders and they welcomed the Crusaders, and the Crusaders even had to swear allegiance to the Eastern Roman Emperor as part of the deal. And part of the deal was that as the Crusaders would go through, that the Crusaders would liberate these territory and hand it back over to the Eastern Roman Empire. Yeah, right. That wasn't going to happen. Because there's no way and it didn't happen at all. Now, because that by this point the papists were completely very anti-orthodox, and we'll see what happens as the armies move into the east. But this was the condition. The condition was that the Emperor Alexios would open Eastern Roman territory to the Crusaders, and even supply them with in some cases, and then would even help them. And then the Crusaders would hand all this land, even all the way to Jerusalem. That Jerusalem, Syria, it would all be handed back over to the Eastern Roman Empire. But that was, of course, not going to happen. And we see that this is a very big problem because we can see that all of this situation, it's not addressing the issue of the papism. And this is the problem because it's the papism of the heresy. I mean, even the fact that it wasn't dealt with even before the schism, which is also, remember, a lot of it was also that the Eastern Roman Empire was in constant war with Bulgaria. And with that war, very earthly war, a lot of the people were forgetting the fact that that even before 1054, the heresy in the West was getting so out of hand. But now, whether it was a combination of things, like, of course, we know that the Orthodox were waiting for the repentance until 1054. But it didn't happen, unfortunately, and now we have the situation where the papists are now really the greatest adversary of the Orthodox, which is a very tragic thing. Now, this army that was raised by the papists, it was a lay army, meaning the people, or the peasants, the people, as well as a more trained army. Now, the people's, it was actually called the People's Crusade, which was actually the group that was, and it was thousands and thousands, as much as 40,000 people. People basically with all these supplies, like basically almost like farmers with pitchforks kind of deal. But they did have weapons, not just pitchforks, of course, but they did raise and make a lot of weapons to bring. But this was a large mob of people with also even not only men also, but it was people that would basically march. It was like a giant march that would go right across through Eastern Roman Empire straight to Jerusalem. Remember, the goal was Jerusalem. Remember, the goal for the papists was to conquer Jerusalem. It was all basically a lie. So now with this people's army, now one of the things, actually, a very big thing that's always discussed with the First Crusade, which was a very unfortunate thing, was that the Crusaders actually massacred a very large Jewish population in several places. Now remember that this is kind of something that has to be mentioned because remember, in most of Western Europe, above the Mediterranean especially, because remember there are large Islamic populations within the parts of Western Europe on the Mediterranean, but when you go up further north, really almost the entire population at this point is Papist. There are no pagans at all. So it's very uniformly Papist. There are no more Orthodox. Everything is just completely papist. The only people who are not papist are the Jews. And the Jews in this area had kind of developed this very unhealthy relationship between the papists and the Jews. A lot of it was that, going back to Charlemagne, he had invited them to come in, and they had settled in what was Middle Francia. But there's no more Middle Francia because at this point the HR Empire had taken it over. But this middle area, up especially along the Rhine, was where a large population of the Jews had settled. And they're the origin of who become the Ashkenazi, the Yiddish-speaking Western European Jews, basically. And what happens is that they went in heavily to the money lending field, let's say. And that was, a lot of it was because, going back to when the West was, let's say, more orthodox, it is true that we do have, of course, canons against things like money lending. But the thing is that Charlemagne, being so wicked, going back to Charlemagne, he kind of outsourced it to the Jews. And it kind of made it so that a lot of the nobility will have kind of beholden to the Jews for financial reasons. And they will protect them at times, but then at some times also be violent against them if they got too much money. Because a lot of times, besides the nobility, the Jews will be the ones that kind of hold a little bit more wealth than a lot of the general population of the papists. That will also instigate a lot of violence against them. But it's a very unhealthy kind of thing. And it also, remember, fueled a lot on the Jewish side, also fueled them becoming more anti-Christian, as if they weren't already. But remember, this is also part of the tragedy, because it's bad enough that the papists were falling into heresy, that it was heretical. But remember is that when you have Orthodox Christians living an Orthodox life in true Christianity, other people will come to Orthodoxy. People will see the light of Christ if it's a true Orthodox life. But when you have things like papism, and you have people murdering and massacring and slaughtering, that just pushes the people the other way, and it makes them blaspheme Christianity even more. So it's a very bad situation. It's something that really characterizes the papist world at this time and in the future. And also remember, a lot of the people, in order to buy weapons, had spent a lot of money. So they actually literally owed a lot of loans to the Jews for raising a lot of the weapons. So that also was another reason for a lot of their massacre at this point. But anyway, the massacring is only just beginning. But now, as time goes on, as this army, this people's army, and it started in the year 1096, the spring of 1096, they start marching down into Eastern Roman territory, and then as they're going through the territory of the Eastern Roman Empire, they're on a local level, they're making a mess. There is a lot of assaulting and harassing of the local population, of the Orthodox population, as they move across. Especially the peoples. The people's army, or the people's crusade, that was more the untrained people, they actually, even when they passed through the territory that is the Serbia area, they actually burned Belgrade and the city Niš. The city of Niš suffered a lot of damage, and Belgrade was burned. And as they went further south, as they got towards Constantinople, we still have the situation as they got closer to Constantinople, they started to behave a little bit better, because remember that the emperor was supposedly on the same side. So they wanted to try to be on their best behavior, even though it didn't always work, because there was a lot of atrocities as they went through. Now, of course, the Eastern Roman Emperor Alexios II actually helped ferry them across the Bosphorus. Now, as they got towards the borders of and they supplied them with weapons also, because they knew that, remember, all these untrained people, it's basically a mob, if you could picture this. It's a mob of people just literally just on foot, just marching across. Now, it was known that once they got into Muslim territory, the Muslims were just going to slaughter them to death. It was going to be a massacre. So the emperor did provide them with a lot of weapons. Now, as they got into the territory of the Sultanate of Rome, they were able to liberate the city of Nicaea, which had fallen to the Muslims. And we see that here. Here we see that the Rome starts to shrink a little bit because that's the territory that they lost briefly. But once they crossed over into Muslim territory, um, the People's Army got very weakened. But what followed them was called the Prince's Army. Those were the more trained knights of the Crusades, the actual fighting force. When they came through, they once they got into Muslim territory, then that was it. Then they didn't have to answer to the emperor anymore. That's when things got violent. And then they got to Jerusalem. Once they got to Jerusalem around the year 1099, we know that there was a very big massacre, and a lot of the population of Jerusalem was massacred. And remember, that includes all of the population, whether there was the Muslim population, there was a Jewish population in Jerusalem all were massacred, and the Christian population. Because remember, the Crusaders couldn't tell locally who was what necessarily by their appearance in Jerusalem. They just indiscriminately just slaughtered as they went through. And basically, we have here this situation where now I went forward a little few years to the next century, the 1100. Now we have the Jerusalem conquered, and Aleppo and Syria was conquered, and now the papists established papist states in all the places that they conquered. They also ousted all of the most of the Orthodox clergy, including the patriarchs. So the Patriarchate of Antioch and the Patriarchate of Jerusalem were deposed and thrown out by the papists, and the papists put in Latin papist patriarchs. And this is going to basically characterize. Now, at first, the control of the Crusaders was centered basically in the area called the Levant. When we say the Levant, we're talking about the shores of the eastern Mediterranean. So the area of like modern day, the Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, especially the parts of Syria along the Mediterranean coast, that's considered to be the Levant or Levantine. So the papists basically conquered pretty much all of the Levant and established papist states. So there was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and then there was the County of Edessa and the Principality of Antioch. And basically the papist nobility will be the ones who rule over this area. Especially the royalty of France, which in Jerusalem will become the Lusignan house, which is a papist house, noble house, that will rule over Jerusalem in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which will basically cover much of what's the Palestine area. Now, when it comes to the Eastern Roman Empire, when the papists passed through, when the armies of the Crusades passed through, they didn't do anything to any clergy there because they were trying to be on the good graces of the emperor. It wasn't until really they passed over into Muslim territory that when they encountered the Orthodox locally, the churches, that's when they got aggressive because they knew that the emperors could not exercise their authority there. So, and this will be something that, because remember, this is only the beginning of the Crusades. Now, of course, in the next few videos, we'll discuss the Second and the Third Crusade, which are rather minor. But then when we get to the middle of the 1200s, we will see that there will be the Fourth Crusade. And the Fourth Crusade will end with the complete conquest of Constantinople and the destruction of the Eastern Roman Empire by the Crusaders. And when the Crusaders take over the Eastern Roman Empire in the East, in Constantinople, there they will do the same thing. They will replace the Patriarch of Constantinople with a Latin Patriarch. They will establish papist duchies all through Greece, all through the East. Only a remnant Epirus and a kingdom of Nicaea and Trapezunda will be the three remnant Eastern Roman Empire kingdoms that will eventually come together again in the 1400s, and then that will be the last iteration of the Eastern Roman Empire until the final fall in 1453. but we're not up to that yet. But for now, the Eastern Roman Empire is still relatively strong, but it's going to be basically eroded by the Crusaders because of this happening with the Crusaders and the fact that they did what they did. Now the Eastern Roman Empire is at war with the Crusaders because basically they betrayed the Eastern Roman Empire. Not that the Eastern Roman Empire ever should have been allied with them in the first place. Now, going back to the Normans that I had mentioned a little bit earlier, the Normans, as we said, had conquered England, and they had also participated, along with France and the other papist states, with the Crusades. A little bit before 1095, going back to 1085, the 1080s, the Normans had already conquered much of southern Italy and Sicily. Actually, the Normans conquered Sicily from the Muslims, because Sicily had been under the Muslims for a while, and southern Italy also. And this kingdom is called the Kingdom of Sicily, ruled though by the Normans. And so there's a German, basically Germanic aspect to it, which will basically be characteristic of most of Western Europe's nobility, even up to modern times, is that these are the families that pretty much will rule Western Europe even to this day, that are part of like the main royal houses of today, that are even of Spain and this area. They were houses that especially that were all intermarried with their base really was the HR, but they were all sitting on the thrones of France, at this point England, the Spanish states, and southern Italy. So the Normans actually control southern Italy. Now, a little bit before the Crusades, the Normans had taken parts of the Greek islands and parts of Greece. That's where this map is a little bit inaccurate because it doesn't show it. But around the 1080s, the Normans, under a warrior named Robert de Guiscard, had conquered the Greek islands of Kephallonia and some of the other islands in Greece. Uh, and with the Ionian Islands, which are the islands in western Greece, from that point on, from the 1080s, for many, many centuries, hundreds and hundreds of years, they will actually be, for the most part, under the rule of the papists, all the way up until the time of basically modern Greece, the Greek Revolution. So they will have only a very brief period under Ottoman rule, but they will be mostly under the papists. Later, the Venetians, but at this point, the Venetians are not that powerful, but they are one of the states that will be very big influencers in this area, because where now the Normans and most of the other Crusader states were more warrior, knightly, quote unquote, states, the Venetians will be a little bit different than the other papists. And this is Venice, of course, right here, where I'm pointing to. The Venetians will be more merchants, and they will deal more in trade first with the Eastern Roman Empire, and then later with the Ottomans. And the Venetians will be the one group that within Greece will have the most lasting impact, leading all the way up until the time even of the Greek independence, even as we get closer to modern times. And Venice itself was a newer city. It was a city that had only developed in the late the late 700s, and it's possible that it's a very big theory, but that the last ruler of the Exarchate of Ravenna when the Eastern Roman Empire controlled central Italy, back when the West was still Orthodox, that the last one who was, although he was an iconoclast at that time, that he was the one actually that founded Venice and was the first Doge or Duke of Venice. So Venice always had a little bit of a checkered history, because also before Venice was officially founded, the city right next to it, that was the more ancient city, was the city of Aquileia and Grado. And I kind of mentioned it in one of the earlier videos, especially with the Fifth Ecumenical Council. But locally, back when the West was Orthodox, there was a local schism of the bishops in northern Italy against the Fifth Ecumenical Council. They were anti-Fifth Ecumenical Council, and it was called the Schism of the Three Chapters. I mentioned this in the earlier video, but you can see more details about that. And in the video on the Fifth Ecumenical Council and the other playlist, I kind of mentioned this. But this schism was in this area of Grado and Aquileia, and the Church of Aquileia kind of was trying to maintain that this minor local schism. But this was when the West was still very orthodox, and when, like, Saint Gregory the Dialogist, a saint was the Bishop of Rome. So of course that was way before this. But now Venice kind of is replaced those cities. Now that schism had ended way before, like in the early 700s. Um, and just they became just part of the orthodoxy in the West. But that was way before this. Now Venice is going to be a very big pain for the East, because Venice is going to become extremely wealthy because of the trade, and will also take over a lots of territories of Greece. Later on, they will take the Ionian Islands, Crete, but most of the large islands, and there will be a very big papist presence within Greece. And that's another thing that I think we forget, because even, like, I know from just even my own experience, that a lot of times even people nowadays forget that, because we always think, like, in the context even of Greece, we think only of the Ottomans, the 400 years of the Ottoman occupation. But remember, through a lot of that 400 years, actually, the Ottomans did not necessarily control all parts of the Greek areas. It was actually the papists. The papists, for a lot of history, controlled, like, Nafplion and Crete and Rhodos and Chios under the Genovese, and the islands, a lot of the islands of the Aegean, and the Peloponnesos. The Venetians had Peloponnesos through a lot of that, and the Ionian Islands as well. So it's only in later Ottoman times that the Ottomans were able to take a little bit more territory. But there was still a lot of the papist presence in these areas, including, and also Cyprus as well. Cyprus will become a very big crusader state also, because Cyprus will be basically the fallback point for the kingdom of Jerusalem, because the papist kingdom of Jerusalem will also control Cyprus, the Lusignans. And when the Muslims under Saladin retake Jerusalem and kick out the papist rulers, they will fall back to Cyprus and attempt the Second and the Third Crusade. That'll be in the next video, though. But now we can see this is the way things are at the time of the Crusades. And before I finish this video, one last thing I wanted to mention was that as the Orthodox were the bishops were thrown out of these areas and replaced. Another thing is also I'll get to this when we get to the Fourth Crusade, because the papists will also even replace the Patriarch of Constantinople with a Latin patriarch. Now, to this day in Jerusalem, even now, there's still a Latin patriarch of Jerusalem there. There is no longer any of Antioch, but a lot of people don't know this, is that the papists, until modern times, the year 1962, think about that for a second. Until 1962, the papists actually had a papist, a so-called patriarch, a Latin patriarch of Constantinople. But they actually retired it, they ended it in 1962, right before Athenagoras and all of the ecumenism in modern times. So think about that sink in, because it was a very big, the fact that they ended it in 1962, right before the ecumenism. And speaking of ecumenism and all these false unions, within the area of Lebanon, parts of Lebanon and Syria, there was an old community that had lived there of Monotheletites. Not the straight Monophysites, but Monotheletites. If we remember the Monotheletism heresy, of the one will heresy, which was originally a way of the ecumenistic, the emperors at the time, of bridging to the Monophysites. They made a compromise heresy. It mostly had died out, but there was a small group in the community, the monastic community of Saint Maron. Now, Saint Maron was an Orthodox saint originally, from early times. But in the area, it had become monotheletism. Now, those monotheletisms actually joined with the papists, and they became sort of an Eastern an Eastern Uniate like monothelitism version of the papists. Those are the Maronites to this day. So the Maronites were the monothelites who were already heretical before this, but they joined with the papists. And also in Tarsus area, Cilicia here, the Armenians, because the Armenians had aided the Crusaders also, the Crusaders allowed the Armenians to create an Armenian monophysite kingdom. That's what this little blue is. We could get a little closer. This blue part where it says Cilicia, that's an Armenian monophysite kingdom that the Papists allowed because they had helped. Oh, there were a lot of Armenians in this area because the Armenians, mainly the monophysite Armenians, had already had a large diaspora through many parts of the Middle East, but especially this area, because the Armenian heartland was constantly getting conquered by the different states, like Islamic states. So it caused them to have a very large diaspora. There were a lot of the Armenians who were Orthodox that were not monophysites, but the ones that were the monophysites also had their own communities also, living alongside other people, because they were also a very visible minority in the Middle East historically. But here they have their own kingdom because of the Crusades. So we can see how the different heretical groups all worked together. It's a very tragic thing. So I just moved the map forward another 20 years, and we can see now the full effect of the Crusader occupation. This Edessa is a Papist state. This Aleppo here is a Papist state. That's the Principality of Antioch. And of course, this blue here, roughly where modern day the country Israel is today, that is the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which is a Papist state. So I'll get to the next part as we discuss now what happens as a result of this and into the later parts of the next of this century, the 1100s. That's all for now. Glory to God. Doxa tol Theo.